My name is Jessica Marra. I'm here with Jason Jaffery, the Development Director from the ACLU of Ohio. It's September 14th. We're in the Columbus office of the ACLU of Ohio, and we're here with Larry Herman. How are you today?
Just fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. We're going to start with some very general questions to get a basic background. Can you start with when and where you were born?
Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, May the 13th, 1929.
Okay, and can you talk about your family life when you were growing up?
It was just your ordinary Cincinnati family life. Mom was a stay-at-home mom. Dad was an upper middle level executive with a union, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. He was active in local politics. He was committed to the Democrats. He was liberal in his beliefs, and eventually some of that seeped into me.
So you have always sort of been interested in civil liberties and equality based on your family life?
Actually, the only way you can separate yourself from a parent is to go the other way. So even into the early part of law school, I would have regarded myself as fairly conservative. There were issues, however. It was not easy growing up in Cincinnati. Cincinnati had very bad race relations, and even as a kid I was aware of discrimination against people of color. Cincinnati had a strong strain of anti-Semitism, which I experienced personally. And so I think my earliest interest in civil liberties was in equality.
And can you talk about your education and what you studied?
I went to the University of Cincinnati, majored in English, offended in some way the head of the English department. In those days, if you had 3 years of undergraduate school, you could go to law school and get your undergraduate degree after 1 year of law school. I decided my future was not with the English department, and how could it hurt to have 1 year of law school? I hated the first semester of law school. In the second semester, I encountered a program called Moot Court, in which I got to play lawyer, write a brief, make an argument, and since I had done some amateur theatrical work when I was a kid, I was in my element. I loved it, and I sailed through law school after that.
Can you talk about how you came to be involved with the ACLU?
I came to be involved with the ACLU through my interest in the death penalty. I started teaching in 1959 at Western Reserve. In 1960, a bill was pending in the Ohio General Assembly to abolish the death penalty, and a committee of legislators had a dog and pony show around the state, including Cleveland, and I was invited to testify. I was ambivalent about the death penalty. I was not an opponent of it. I was ambivalent. I began to do some legal research, and I became a committed opponent of the death penalty. Although originally I was going to testify ambivalently, I testified strongly against it. My testimony was carried a little blurb in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and I was then asked to join a statewide organization of opposition to the death penalty. When I moved from Western Reserve to Ohio State, one of my students was an assistant professor of history. He was a member of the ACLU, and I used the death penalty as an introductory subject to the criminal law. He mentioned that to his friend Benson Woolman. And I got a call from Benson, whom I did not know, asking me if I would talk about the death penalty at a chapter meeting. And I said I would, and I went down to the Y on a snowy February evening. There were 5 people there. And I talked for about an hour on the death penalty. When that was over, Benson and I had a conversation. He told me the ACLU was committed against the death penalty. I'd always thought of the ACLU as a slightly kooky left-wing organization. And he asked me if I would join. And I said, yeah, I will. And I want to do anti-death penalty work. So I became a member of the ACLU. Eventually, I think I was on the board of the Columbus chapter. Then became a member of the state board, and in 1968, I replaced Oscar Steiner as Ohio's representative to the ACLU National Board. And I remained on the national board until 1987. For 6 of those years, 80 to 86, I was one of the national organization's 3 general counsel.
That's great. Thank you. You answered a lot of my questions there.
Oh, good.
That was great.
Yeah.
So can you talk about your time on the board? How was it being a representative of Ohio on the national board?
The fact that I was from Ohio didn't make very much difference until certain issues peculiar to Ohio arose, such as the Akron reproductive case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, Kent State also. But by and large, I assimilated myself to the national board, and I never had a conflict between my own views, let me put it this way, between what the Ohio board voted for and what the national board voted for. That usually in situations, and there were few, in which the Ohio board might have opposed the national board's stance, I agreed with the Ohio board anyhow. And so, as in my capacity as a national board member, I was simply trying to do what I thought was right.
Do you recall any of those instances where the Ohio board and the national board were conflicting about anything?
I'd have to think about that. I'm certain there was. One of them had to do with hate speech. The Ohio board took the position that hate speech was still speech, and that the fact that an individual committed a crime out of bias against somebody because of color, religion, ethnicity was not a justification for increasing the penalty. It was, obviously, if somebody committed an assault or a murder, you try them for the assault or for the murder, but you don't enhance the penalty because of their belief that the person they injured was an inferior person. We were opposed to that. When that came up in the national board, I think the national board took a slightly different view of it.
Can you give us an idea of sort of the culture of the national board at that time? Maybe some people who were on it with you, important people in the ACLU, some important cases or issues that came up during the time you served on the board?
Oh, there were a lot of important cases, and I was involved with some of the lawsuits when I became a member of the General Counsel. In that capacity, when we had some criminal cases, I often contributed something to the brief that we submitted. But my role on the national board was basically to decide which cases should go to the United States Supreme Court, or occasionally in representation of a client to federal district court. And not only which cases should go, but interestingly, what our legal position should be. Because some of the cases we had involved a clash of civil liberties. Right to privacy on the one hand, defendant's right to a fair trial getting information on the other hand. and we would have to decide on behalf of which civil liberty value the ACLU would intervene. As far as the board itself, I thought it was one of the great debating societies that I had ever encountered. There were a lot of very, very bright people, a lot of academics, and a big difference of opinion on a number of issues. ACLU has a left wing, a center, and a right wing. I was more comfortable being on some issues in the center or slightly to the right of center, and on other issues I was way to the left. Those way to the left issues were usually criminal due process issues. And where I was right of center was on issues relating to whether something should be regarded as a civil liberty. And it should be part of ACLU's bag of interests and activities. I more often than not took the position that the ACLU had enough to do representing the Bill of Rights and not taking a position that there was a civil right or civil liberty to housing, and that we were trying to undertake too much. And it seemed to me we were doing less and less about more and more. And my great fear was that we would eventually do everything about, nothing about everything. And that we had limited resources, limited personnel. We relied heavily on volunteer attorneys. And I thought that working with free speech and other provisions of the Bill of Rights, we had almost all that we could handle.
Following up on famous cases and famous issues and really notable historical issues that the National ACLU has dealt with, we've interviewed David Goldberger, and you were on the national board and on the Ohio board when the ACLU took the case in Skokie.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk about Skokie, both your personal perspective as somebody who was exposed to anti-Semitism when you were young, and also from your position on the national board?
David Goldberger, as you know, is my colleague on the law faculty at Ohio State. I have never had any difficulty at all with the ACLU taking the position it did in Skokie. That's the position that the Ohio ACLU took. Benson Woolman strongly. He and I agreed on First Amendment issues. This was clearly a First Amendment issue. We had the same sort of First Amendment issue in Ohio when I think the American Nazi Party wanted to hold a meeting or a demonstration on State House grounds. Benson Woolman represented them successfully in the United States Supreme Court. That is no problem whatsoever. I am as close to a free speech absolutist as you can find.
Great. And what was it like being a national board member and seeing the process of the National ACLU taking on this case and the national reaction to it?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I know there were a lot of people out their land who were outraged by that. But for me, and I think for the ACLU, this was a run-of-the-mill, very important, but run-of-the-mill First Amendment case. I don't have to agree with what you say. I can revile what you say. and still vigorously support your right to say it, free from governmental censorship. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's talk about some of the people that you've gotten to work with. I read that you worked with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Can you sort of talk about how you met her and what you've learned from her?
Ruth at one time was a general counsel. That was before my time as general counsel. When I came to know her, she was head of ACLU's Women's Rights Project. And I regarded myself as a feminist, so by and large, her views and my views coincided. One of the difficult issues for the ACLU board was adopting a policy on rape, especially with reference to matters such as whether a defendant should be allowed to introduce evidence of the complainant's prior sexual history. And there was a strong group against that. There was another group, of which I was a member, saying, at least in some rape cases, evidence of prior sexual history might be relevant to the defendant's defense, and as a due process matter, you should not exclude the relevant evidence. And we argued about that at board meetings. But our arguments were always civil. To some extent, they were glorified faculty meetings because so many of us were academics. Or meetings of a group of lawyers in a law firm because so many of us, but not all of us, were lawyers. And we just hashed them out and we voted. And if you lost, you lost. But you expected, you respected the integrity of the people who were on the winning side. And it was very easy for us to go out and have dinner together, although some of us voted one way and some another. We had some very controversial issues. For example, should we oppose the nomination of Robert Bork to the U.S. Supreme Court? I was one of those opposing it. The ACLU had never opposed a nomination to the Supreme Court, had always taken the position that was a political matter and that the ACLU should not get involved. I had no love for Robert Bork. I thought he was unqualified for the U.S. Supreme Court. And I thought he'd be detrimental to civil liberties, even though in some of his testimony he tried to palm himself off as a centrist. But I thought we should not oppose him publicly, and I took that position and voted that way, and I lost. Same thing happened on the Vietnam War issue. Should we oppose the Vietnam War on civil liberties grounds? There had not, Congress had not voted a declaration of war, and there were people who were arguing that was to go into Vietnam without that was a violation of civil liberties. I had trouble seeing the civil liberties issue, especially since Congress had appropriated a lot of money for the war, and although it did not formally issue a declaration of war, it indicated its support for the war. And I voted against our taking that position. On the Nixon impeachment, I was bedrock opposed to our becoming prosecutors, in effect, and wanting to prosecute Richard Nixon in an impeachment proceeding. When I listened to the arguments that were being made to the National Board, especially by my friend Chuck Morgan, who was then head of the Washington office, I said that I got up and I said, Chuck sounded to me like a prosecutor. making all of the arguments a prosecutor would make, looking at the impeachment provisions of the Constitution and interpreting them broadly in favor of the government and narrowly in favor of the defendant, when things should be the other way around in a civil liberties organization. And so I was one of those who voted against our calling for the impeachment of Richard Nixon.
Did you ever get a chance to work with Roger Baldwin or meet Roger Baldwin?
I met Roger Baldwin. I did not get a chance to work with him very much. He was in his late 80s, I think, when I met him. He was a presence. I also had occasion to meet Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in one of my very early meetings. And it was a very controversial meeting because somebody had proposed that we repeal something known as the 1940 resolution. That resolution required that people who were in positions of authority in the ACLU basically support democracy and forswear totalitarianism. And if you supported totalitarian regimes, you were a bad person. It seemed to me that for an organization as committed to the First Amendment as the ACLU was, having the 1940s resolution was a blot on our escutcheon. And during the debate on that issue, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said it was essential to retain the 1940s resolution. He said that we would jeopardize our financial position if we did. We donors would pull away from us, and we would lose members if we got rid of the 1940s resolution. And I didn't know he was Arthur Schlesinger. I hadn't paid attention to who was saying this. And I got up and said that was the most pusillanimous statement I had ever heard. And it made me almost embarrassed to be a member of the ACLU National Board. That we cut our eye teeth not only on union matters, but on First Amendment matters. And this was detrimental to our First Amendment stance, et cetera, et cetera. And when I sat down, somebody said, "Do you know who you called pusillanimous?" I said, "Whom?" He said, "Arthur Schlesinger Jr." I said, "Oi."
That's great.
Yeah. But I didn't take it back.
Okay. Do you have a favorite memory or something you participated in that you particularly recall fondly during your time with the ACLU?
Yeah, one thing, and it's sort of funny, and it shows you how ACLU board members can disagree on issues given their background and interests. There was a question that arose about the rights of juveniles in the criminal process and whether they were entitled to counsel, something like that. One of our board members was Nanette Dembitz. She was the niece, if I remember, of Louis Dembitz Brandeis, the Louisville lawyer who became a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And she did lots of work with juveniles. And she felt that giving juveniles too many rights was detrimental to them. And she argued against a adoption of a policy that would have conferred rights on juveniles comparable to those adults had in an adult criminal court. And after she spoke and she made an impassioned speech based on her background working in juvenile law, I got up to speak, and the first thing I said was, "No, no, Nanette." And it brought down the House. It didn't make my argument any better. We did take the position that I urged. But that was typical of the way we conducted ourselves on the board. Interjecting a note of humor here or there, still being friends after vigorous debates.
Do you remember what year or about what time that debate took place?
Well, it had to have taken place after the Galt case or maybe it was contemporaneously with the Galt case in the U.S. Supreme Court. And I don't remember. I can look it up, I suppose, in this book, but it had to do with Galt.
Okay. We're still having that debate, so in some ways.
Can you talk about how you view the ACLU, the changes that have happened in the ACLU, based on when you were on the board to now? How has it changed?
I wish I were more conversant with the ACLU now. I left the board in 1987. I voluntarily left. I told the Ohio ACLU that I was not going to stand for re-election. There were several reasons for that. One, I had figured out shortly before I decided that leaving was a good idea, that I was attending an ACLU meeting once every 4.5 days of my life. And it was interfering with academic writing that I wanted to do. I desperately wanted to write a history of the privilege against compulsory self-incrimination in England and in the United States, and then use that as a basis for making suggestions about the admissibility of confessions in criminal cases. The second reason I wanted to get off was we had a commitment to women's rights in the ACLU. And I had already given up a position on the general counsel because a friend of mine, Vivian Berger, who was a professor of criminal law at Columbia, was a candidate for election to general counsel. And she and I would have opposed each other. And I withdrew and urged the body to support her. It's been, 1987, 23, 35 years? 25 years since I was on the board. I read, I get all of the papers and stuff. I know what their agenda is. The ACLU is doing more, I suppose, than I would have been comfortable with then. But the ACLU is still the most important civil liberties game in town. And I support it. I'm on the National Advisory Council. I spend some time in New York, and I hope someday it's going to coincide with an ACLU board meeting so I can go there and sit in on the board and see what they're doing. But whether they're arguing the same things, I suspect they are. The things we were arguing in the 1960s are still being argued today, and it's going to go on that way. There's never going to be a consensus on what a civil liberty is, and it seemed to me that so many of our debates involved trying to invent or reinvent ourselves. And that's going to go on forever. That's a good idea. I'm very impressed with what the ACLU is doing. One of your questions to me was, who were the executive directors I served under? That made me think. Jack Pemberton was the executive director when I arrived. He resigned to do other things with his life, and Aryeh Nair became the executive director. And when the ACLU bureaucracy became too much for Aryeh Nair, after a long and distinguished career, he resigned, and Ira Glasser became the executive director. So I served under those three. I had the privilege of serving with people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Norman Dorson, Roland O'Hare, a Detroit lawyer who was extremely bright, David Isbell, a Washington lawyer, a corporate lawyer, who was committed to civil liberties and did yo-person work on the board. And it was just great being with them. That we became friends, we had dinners together, and we kept in touch over the years.
Jason and Chris wanted to know if you know Bernie Dushman.
Yes, I know Bernie.
Okay. What?
I knew Bernie when Bernie was teaching law. Bernie and I were friends. Bernie and I and Bernie's girlfriend would go out to dinner. And I haven't seen Bernie in years. Why did you ask me that question?
Describe your relationship with him as leaders with the ACLU and his role with the ACLU.
He was on the state board. He and I got along very well. We agreed on almost everything. And I haven't seen him probably for most of a decade. I don't know where he is. I was delighted to see his name. Yes.
Okay. And we're working on historical case summaries for our website. Are there any cases that you worked on or that you can think of that the Ohio ACLU worked on that you think are important cases that we should summarize for our website?
The Kent State cases. That's from an Ohio standpoint. The Akron reproductive case, the cases that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's another case that went up. A former student of mine, Nikki Schwartz, who is, of course, one of Cleveland's premier lawyers, both civil and criminal, represented the defendant in a case in which the defendant had been tried in a mayor's court. And I don't remember the name of the case. And it was for a traffic offense, and the fine would have gone into the coffers of the municipality. And an argument was made and preserved that this made the mayor biased and he should have recused himself. And Nikki took the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and won it. And I think that is, and the issue of mayor's courts is still very live in Ohio. The Columbus Dispatch did an excellent investigative journalism piece on mayor's courts. And this is a very important case in the history of the law governing mayor's courts and should be summarized. Yeah.
Jason, is there anything you wanted to ask about that I skipped over?
Not that you necessarily skipped over, but I do have a few questions. One, going back to some famous cases, just a question and remind me of time in history. Were you on the board or involved when Brandenburg occurred?
I don't remember the answer to that. I can look it up. Let's see if Sam Walker refers to Brandenburg.
Mm-hmm.
Brandenburg, 281.
Good thing you brought that.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, this is in the chapter on From Vietnam to Watergate.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on the board then because I was involved with the debates on Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. So
I must have been on the board when Brandenburg was decided. But I was not personally involved in that case.
Okay. Talking about Kent State a little bit, I mean, there are certain points in the ACLU of Ohio's history that we see as pivotal, and we've talked to some people that were involved with the ACLU starting in the 1950s,
mm-hmm.
and then Kent State and its impact on the profile of the ACLU and Benson's involvement with the ACLU. We view it as pivotal, but I'd love to hear your impressions both of the case and how it impacted the direction and growth of the ACLU.
As far as the growth of the ACLU, I think what ACLU was doing in that case appealed to young people in a way that many of ACLU's activities would not. And I'm certain it had some effect in enlarging our membership. One of my colleagues was very much involved, Michael Geltner, was very much involved in the Kent State case. And he was handling it for the ACLU. I was not deeply involved in the case, although in discussions about where ACLU might go with it, I was involved, being a member of the board and also a member of the National Board. I want to say a few words about my dear friend and Columbus brother, Benson Woolman. When I get to heaven, I'm going to kick his butt for not taking better care of himself. He was the face of ACLU, and he was the voice of ACLU. And there is no one in the history of the Ohio ACLU who was more important to the success of the ACLU. No one more important than Benson. What Chris has done over the years is remarkable, and I'm not dissing Chris in the slightest. But the organization is much more of an organization. Organization was not Benson's forte. Civil liberties were his forte, and he represented the ACLU as a lobbyist and as subsequently as a lawyer at the highest levels.
Okay, that's great. So again, in terms of the ACLU of Ohio, you were the national board rep from, tell me.
From 68 to 87.
68 to
87. And I was on the state board, I think, for all of that time. And when I resigned from the national board, I think subsequently I resigned from the state board because I wanted to devote myself more to academic writing on civil liberties matters. I mean.
Sure. So, and you mentioned who had preceded you as national board rep.
Oscar Steiner. I think he was I'm going to say he was an Akron businessman who had contributed greatly financially to the ACLU, who could take the time to attend national board meetings. When I started on the national board met only twice. By the time I was off it, we were meeting 5 times a year. And we could have met more often than that.
Do you recall who preceded Oscar as National Board Rep?
No. Okay. I'm not sure anybody preceded Oscar. I'd never heard anybody say that there was somebody before Oscar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask you some probing questions now to establish a timeline.
I'll tell you one other thing.
Sure, go ahead.
One of my pleasures in ACLU was after Benson became the National Board Rep when I resigned. And when he resigned, Julia Davis became the National Board Rep. Julia was one of my students. So it was like having one of your own kids follow you on the national board.
So this might be tough to establish a timeline. So let me know if you can't connect the dots. But
okay.
We're trying to connect some dots in terms of leadership in Ohio. So I mean, you had mentioned that that Benson had an enormous impact. Do you recall one board presidents, sort of the sequence of board presidents?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. I know Howard Besser was board president for a long time, and his wife was president also, Barbara Besser. I just, no.
Okay. Do you recall any board president or board presidents that you feel kind of had a major impact on the direction of the ACLU of Ohio?
No, I can't, and I'm not sure it would be fair to say that any board president had a major impact, or to expect that they would have. Policy was made by the board and executed by the executive director, who was instrumental in urging the board to adopt certain policies. The president basically presided at board meetings and was a board member, but had only one vote on the board.
Okay, that's fair. So during the time that you were on the board, the organization of the ACLU of Ohio was much different than it is now. Can you kind of describe how it operated? I mean, there were a couple of different offices, as there are now, but it operated a little bit differently.
It did, and Columbus was the center of it. And there was the Cleveland office. There was a Cincinnati office. I think those were the offices. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure there was an office as such in Toledo. And you would have to inform me what the structure is. I know the state office is in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. That I know. And there is an office in Columbus. I don't even know if there's an office in Cincinnati.
There's not. There's just the two offices. Mm-hmm. So the headquarters is in Cleveland now, and we have this office in Columbus.
Mm-hmm. Your staff is considerably larger. The legal staff is larger. The legal staff is doing more than in the days when I was on the board. It's involved in more cases in the state of Ohio. Mm-hmm. The ACLU is a bigger presence in the state of Ohio. Benson was such a dominant personality, and I mean that approvingly. The newspapers loved to ask him questions. The television reporters loved to get him before the television cameras, because he would always say something catchy, but at the same time full of substance. And so it made a lot of sense to have the state office in in Columbus when he was the executive director. Yeah.
And
besides, I've always thought Cleveland felt it was not really a part of Ohio. But it was rather, Cleveland looked to New York, yes, and not to the rest of Ohio. But that was just a biased view of mine.
Okay, so again, thinking sort of historically during
Yes.
your tenure, do you recall, or can you think of any elected officials, policymakers, nonpartisan on either side of the aisle or on neither side of the aisle, that you feel were great civil libertarians or played a real role in the
Harry
ACLU?
Lehman, from Cleveland, as I remember, was. He's the name that comes first to my mind. There were others who supported, certain positions that we took, but not others, and would never have done it in the name of the ACLU. Harry wasn't afraid to associate himself with the ACLU. He, above all, I think.
Okay.
Mary Jean Valaquette, who was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee and kept the death penalty bill from being voted on for a long, long while. On the death penalty, she was a very strong supporter of ACLU's position. To an extent, my former student, Paul Pfeiffer, who was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee when the death penalty was reenacted in Ohio. Benson and I, Ohio had screwed up the death penalty without the help of the ACLU. When it was considering reenacting the death penalty, we just stayed in the background because we thought they were going to screw it up, and they did. And it fell in the wake of a U.S. Supreme Court case that said that Ohio's death penalty statute was unconstitutional. Sandra Lockett. I was involved personally in a companion case, Willie Lee Bell, and wrote the ACLU's amicus curiae brief for the U.S. Supreme Court. But eventually, there was going to be a death penalty bill. Then there would be hearings on it. And I said to Benson asked me to testify. I said, no, let him screw it up again. And he said, no, please. They're gonna pass this, and it's gonna be. They may do just enough to pass muster. And I said, okay, I'll testify. And I testified over a series of evenings with the objective of making the death penalty law as substantively narrow as possible and as procedurally protective as possible. And Senator Pfeiffer supported most of the suggestions that I made. At the time of the Lockett case, 2 out of every 5 persons on death row in the United States were on death row either in Ohio or Florida. That's how much of a player Ohio was on the death penalty scene. Now, you look at the statistics, Ohio isn't in the top 10 states with people on death row. The 1/3 of the executions in the United States occur in Texas. So Pfeiffer, who was not a member of the ACLU, but could understand the good legal argument, supported most of what the ACLU was presenting in testimony. And of course, now, very recently, he testified against the death penalty on the bill that would have knocked out the death penalty in Ohio.
So that's a great story,
Yeah.
and is it okay?
Yeah,
Leads
go
me
ahead.
to the next question. wonderful story of an example of how you and Benson worked together, sort of worked collaboratively together, strategically together, where he recruited you, you negotiated. Any other favorite memories of times where that partnership occurred?
There must have been. Nothing comes to my mind like that. Benson and I were very close. My late wife and I and Benson and Jerry were very close friends, and we'd go out to dinner together and schmooze. It wasn't all ACLU stuff. Sometimes it was fine wine. And
okay.
Yeah.
So again, going back to Benson for a
yes.
moment, any notable civil liberties achievements that you would want to mention that he was responsible for during his tenure?
Well, his actually representing the American Nazi Party in the Ohio case before the Supreme Court of the United States.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever appear before the Supreme Court?
I have never argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. I was appointed to represent an Ohio defendant by the U.S. Supreme Court. He'd filed his own petition for review, and he'd attached the dissenting opinion of an Ohio Supreme Court judge who had somewhat overstated the position. And the U.S. Supreme Court granted review and then appointed me to represent him. I'd done a lot of trial work. I'd never done any appellate work. One of my colleagues, who was the director of our legal clinic, had done both trial and a lot of appellate work in Washington, D.C. I brought him into the case. He and I did the brief together. He argued the case. So,
do you recall who that was?
Gerald Messerman, also one of Cleveland's top lawyers, now retired. Yes. I wrote a number of briefs and was in the U.S. Supreme Court when some of the cases were argued. I was there when the Lockett and Willie Lee Bell cases were argued, the death penalty cases, in 1978, because I had written the amicus brief for the ACLU. But both Lockett was represented by Tony Amsterdam, one of America's great lawyers, a professor of law at NYU and brilliant. And Bell was represented by a Cincinnati lawyer. So I was not slated to argue. I thought I was going to argue a case that came up that was a civil liberties case, not an ACLU case, that arose in Columbus. The name is Burkeamir versus McCarty. McCarty was stopped by a police officer very late at night on the Beltway because he was driving erratically. And eventually he was taken into the police station and was interrogated by the police officer without Miranda warnings. And the question was whether Miranda warnings had to be given in a misdemeanor case, Miranda itself being a felony case. The lawyer who was representing him eventually filed a petition for habeas corpus because the Ohio Supreme Court had said, of course, Miranda doesn't apply to misdemeanors. They wouldn't even grant review in his case. And the federal district judge downtown said, no, Miranda doesn't apply to misdemeanors. The case went to the Sixth Circuit. They said, yes, it does. And the county prosecutor here got review in the U.S. Supreme Court. When I learned about that, I was on good terms with the lawyer. I said, I want in. I want to help you write the brief. And we started working together. He got sick. And so I wrote the whole brief. and I was preparing to argue the case in the U.S. Supreme Court, and he got better. And he said, no, I'm going to argue the case, because he'd never argued a case in the U.S. Supreme Court. So I went up there with him, and...
This close.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's what I've got.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm still waiting for my chance. Yeah.
You got time.
I do.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to talk about that we didn't bring up? Anything you want to mention?
You asked me whether I'd ever received threats or hate mail. I've never received any threats. A little bit of hate mail, especially when I wrote a letter to the editor of the Dispatch criticizing certain police practices, taking people into custody when a subpoena would have done just as well, and the occasional nasty telephone call.
All right, I think that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. This was fun.